It was an unremarkable Wednesday in Flaxborough, a day when the usual rhythms of the town proceeded with the comforting monotony of clockwork. Yet, for Mrs. Agatha Grimble, a widow of considerable discretion and slightly eccentric habits, it was a highlight, the annual flower and garden show at the town assembly hall. The hall itself was a sober building, polished wooden floors reflecting the faintly overcast light from high windows, its air tinged with a mixture of earth, water, and the faint perfume of chrysanthemums long past their peak. Mrs. Grimble, dressed in a muted mauve gown that suggested taste rather than fashion, had arrived early not merely to admire the horticultural efforts, but to observe the citizens of Flaxborough as they fussed over blooms and etiquette in equal measure. Inspector Purbright, as usual, took a discreet seat near the back, notebook in hand, ostensibly to observe the exhibition of roses by Mrs. Pettigrew, an elderly lady who insisted her flowers had emotional temperaments and responded to praise or criticism accordingly. Purbright had little interest in the emotional lives of plants, but he found solace in the predictability of their arrangement. Unlike humans, they adhered strictly to rules. The first signs of disorder arrived with a muffled cry from the dais. Mr. Ferdinand Clapp, chairman of the Horticultural Society, was sprawled on the floor, clutching a shattered display case of tulips. His face was pale, a mixture of embarrassment and distress, as he muttered, It fell. I must have brushed it with my sleeve. Nothing more, nothing less." Flaxborough, as always, refused to believe in mere accidents. Gossip spread with the subtlety of a wildfire, each attendee adding their own layer of conjecture. Mrs. Larkin muttered that Mr. Clapp had always been clumsy, her tone sharpened by a prior family grudge. A young assistant whispered about deliberate sabotage, her imagination fueled by the absence of knowledge. The mild-mannered Mr. Storrington offered sympathy, decrying the tragedy of ruined blooms with a careful balance of sorrow and propriety. Purbright noted the cadence of these reactions with quiet attention, recording not just what was said, but how it was delivered. Mrs. Grimble's eyes flickered as she observed the scene, revealing the faintest trace of awareness that she perceived more than she admitted. She had cultivated the habit of listening between words, noting the unspoken undercurrents of conversation, and she seemed to register that something about the accident, trivial as it appeared, was not entirely straightforward. The mayor, a portly man whose enthusiasm for ceremonial occasions often bordered on theatrical, inspected the ruins with a concerned frown. The tulip display had been intended for a visiting horticultural judge from London, and the collapse threatened to cast the event in a farcical light. Mr. Briscoe, the solicitor whose expressions were perpetually poised between annoyance and condescension, hovered nearby, offering assistance in a manner that suggested both obligation and an unspoken calculation of social advantage. Purbright observed quietly, noting the subtle tensions. Mr. Clapp insisted he had seen a shadowy figure near the dais earlier, though he could not identify the person. The assistant, Miss Penfold, appeared anxious, her hands fluttering nervously as she attempted to rearrange the remaining blooms. Mrs. Larkin, ever vigilant for scandal, whispered conspiratorially to a companion, casting glances at Mrs. Grimble that betrayed a mixture of suspicion and envy. As the hall gradually regained order, a minor debate erupted over responsibility for the mishap. Some argued for practical reparations, others preferred to consider it a symbolic misfortune reflecting the fickleness of life. Mrs. Grimble, meanwhile, lingered at the periphery, listening intently, her knitting needles clicking faintly, her gaze flitting between faces and gestures. She was an observer of human nature in its most performative form, and she noticed what others overlooked, the slight hesitation before a denial, the barely perceptible curl of a lip at the mention of failure, the unsteady glance toward the dais as if seeking reassurance. Purbright, though outwardly detached, began his own mental mapping. There was Mr. Clapp, anxious and unconvincing in his explanation, the mayor performing the duties of reassurance with a careful theatricality, Mr. Briscoe manoeuvring subtly to maintain appearances, and Mrs. Grimble silently cataloguing every reaction. Each had a stake in the unfolding narrative. Each revealed something about the delicate social fabric of the town. By mid-morning, the hall's attention had returned to the flowers themselves, though the incident had left an unspoken residue. Miss Penfold rearranged the tulips with trembling hands, while Mrs. Pettigrew hovered protectively over her prize blooms, eyes darting suspiciously. Purbright made a brief note. The minor disorder had exposed something invisible, a hint of human weakness and ambition beneath the surface of civility. Mrs. Grimble, sensing the subtle rhythms of conversation, leaned slightly toward a cluster of gossiping ladies and made a quiet, almost imperceptible comment. It drew a brief pause, followed by whispered responses that revealed as much about the speakers as the words themselves. Purbright noted the exchange, though the meaning remained opaque. The widow's remarks suggested knowledge without accusation, observation without intrusion. As the afternoon wore on, the flower show continued, but the minor chaos left behind a quiet tension, a ripple in the otherwise calm pond of Flaxborough life. Purbright observed the participants as they adjusted to the disturbance, the smiles more measured, the compliments more cautious. He made a final note before departing. In Flaxborough, even a shattered display of tulips could uncover the subtle interplay of vanity, vigilance, and human foible, and somewhere within that interplay, he suspected, lay the first whisper of a mystery that would require patient and polite untangling. The day following the flower show, Flaxborough seemed to settle back into its habitual rhythm, though beneath the surface small ripples of uncertainty persisted. Mr. Clapp, pale and fidgety, attended to his usual rounds with the air of a man who feared unseen eyes were watching his every movement. Miss Penfold, despite her diligence, bore a faint tension about her posture, as though every glance from a fellow townsman might contain accusation. Mrs. Grimble, however, moved with her customary quiet precision, noting the subtle shifts in expression and gesture that marked each person's response to the previous day's disturbance. Purbright arrived at the Horticultural Society office shortly after 10, carrying his notebook in a manner that suggested routine rather than urgency. He found Mr. Clapp adjusting papers on his desk, each movement meticulous but with a tremor of unease in his hands. "Inspector," Mr. Clapp began, his voice tight, "I trust the matter of the tulips—" "Yes," Purbright interrupted gently, seating himself in the corner where he could observe without interference. "Tell me, Mr. Clapp, if you would, exactly what happened during the display. Every detail, however minor, may be significant." Mr. Clapp's account was precise, yet he stumbled when describing a fleeting shadow near the dais. I thought someone passed by, but the hall was crowded, and the light perhaps misled me." His hesitation was slight, but to Purbright every pause spoke volumes. The solicitor, Mr. Briscoe, arrived mid-morning, ostensibly to deliver papers, yet his presence was more strategic than administrative. He offered formal pleasantries, complimented the flowers with excessive politeness, and in the process revealed his own anxieties about appearances. Purbright observed quietly, noting that Mr. Briscoe's concerns were not for the tulips, but for the potential of gossip gaining traction in the town council. Meanwhile, Mrs. Larkin engaged in her customary rounds of commentary, her voice low and sharp, weaving opinions on the accident with recollections of minor past grievances. Each anecdote, ostensibly unrelated, carried a subtle barb directed at someone else, a remembered slight, a perceived impropriety, a small victory claimed over a neighbour. Purbright, as always, allowed the conversation to unfold, making careful notes of contradictions and embellishments. He noticed that Miss Penfold, though outwardly attentive, avoided eye contact with Mr. Clapp at certain points, while she lingered near the window in moments of perceived privacy. The inspector made no immediate judgment, merely cataloguing the behaviours, aware that the truth often revealed itself in the unguarded moments, the tiny flickers of movement, the incongruities between word and expression. A minor but curious development arose when Mrs. Grimble, visiting under the pretence of returning a borrowed gardening book, lingered by the tea trolley. She conversed politely with the staff, yet her comments contained subtle observations. A mention of a crooked frame on the wall, a remark about a missing ledger on a side table. To anyone else these were trivialities, but to Purbright they formed a pattern of attentiveness that hinted at her perceptive nature. By noon, the town's quieter gossipers began to circulate stories of shadows glimpsed and intentions questioned. A fleeting remark about a man seen near the hall the previous evening, another about papers left out of place, a third about an unreturned library book. Each tiny observation added to a web of conjecture that Purbright regarded with calm interest. Nothing was conclusive, yet everything contained potential insight. Even the mayor, in his routine walk through the streets, was not immune to the lingering whispers. He exchanged greetings with measured warmth, though a faint tightness in his expression suggested that he too felt the subtle unease of a town unsettled, not by catastrophe, but by the perception of disorder. Purbright, noting these shifts, recognized the interplay between reputation and fear, between civility and suspicion, and he considered how easily a minor incident could escalate in a town governed by appearances. As the afternoon wore on, Purbright made a quiet visit to the assembly hall. The tulips had been replaced, but their perfection seemed to accentuate rather than obscure the memory of the mishap. He observed the placement of labels, the spacing of benches, the careful alignment of displays, and all the while he catalogued the human behaviours around them, lingering glances, subtle exchanges, minor gestures of reassurance and concern. Mrs. Grimble appeared once more, arranging a small bouquet for the front window, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. She conversed with a passing gardener in hushed tones, offering advice on watering schedules and soil composition, yet Purbright suspected her focus was elsewhere, on the shadows of motive and intention that most townspeople refused to see. He noted the juxtaposition, a public pretense of civility overlaying a network of private suspicion, the ordinary hiding the extraordinary in plain sight. By the time he departed, Purbright's notebook contained more than statements. It held the impressions of manner, the subtleties of tone, and the faint traces of fear, pride, and ambition that each inhabitant carried. In Flaxborough, even a minor incident at a flower show could leave reverberations beyond the visible, and Purbright understood that these shadows, behind smiles and courteous gestures, would be essential to uncovering the truth. Mrs. Grimble's reputation for discretion was well established in Flaxborough, yet it was precisely her quiet attentiveness that made her presence so unsettling to some. That morning, she walked along the high street with a measured pace, her gloved hands clasping a wicker basket, each movement precise, deliberate, yet seemingly effortless. Passers-by offered polite nods, and she returned them with a faint smile that suggested both awareness and a polite concealment of thought. Purbright had occasion to note her habits because, over the years, he had observed that those who listened more than they spoke often possessed insight far beyond the casual observer. Mrs. Grimble's home, a modest but orderly townhouse on the corner of Elm Lane, contained no ostentation, yet its rooms were arranged with an eye for observation, seating oriented toward windows, mirrors angled to capture peripheral movements. and a library stocked less for reading than for monitoring patterns of habit in townsfolk. On this day, she welcomed Purbright with the usual civility, offering tea and scones in a setting that suggested normalcy, while every glance, gesture, and pause carried subtle meaning. Their conversation touched superficially on gardening techniques, the recent flower show, and the peculiarities of the mayor's comportment, yet beneath the surface, Mrs. Grimble's words contained faint probes, gentle tests designed to elicit reactions without confrontation. Purbright observed that she noticed what others did not: a slightly worn footprint on the rug, an envelope carelessly discarded behind a vase, the faint scent of tobacco clinging to a borrowed shawl, all trivialities, yet each provided a clue to unseen activity. She remarked lightly on the absence of one particular ledger from the Horticultural Society, a remark that might have appeared inconsequential to the untrained ear. Purbright, however, recognized it as deliberate. She was drawing attention to matters that mattered quietly, without accusation. News of minor disputes in the town council, along with whispers of past grievances among Horticultural Society members, had reached her. She spoke of these with a calm amusement, noting contradictions between claimed loyalty and private resentment, never offering judgment, but letting the subtleties reveal themselves. Purbright, accustomed to reading such signs, noted which topics made the widow's eyes brighten with interest, which provoked the faintest tightening of lips and which produced a slight leaning forward in her chair. Small movements that spoke volumes. Miss Penfold, the assistant from the flower show, was mentioned casually. Mrs. Grimble expressed mild curiosity about the girl's nervous energy, commenting on the unpredictability of youth and the necessity of patience. Purbright reflected that the widow's comments were carefully balanced. They neither defended nor condemned, yet they illuminated hidden dynamics. In the afternoon, Mrs. Grimble entertained a visiting neighbour under the pretense of discussing soil quality. During their conversation, she skillfully elicited a minor admission, a forgotten social slight from the prior year, seemingly trivial. Yet to Purbright it suggested a pattern of grievances that might influence behaviour in unexpected ways. He made a careful note. Social history, even in small doses, often revealed motive more clearly than any overt action. Later she walked to the town library, ostensibly to return a borrowed volume on Victorian horticulture. In truth, her movements were a quiet reconnaissance, checking the placement of local announcements and ensuring that minor discrepancies in record-keeping were noted. Purbright had long suspected that the widow collected such observations not for public disclosure, but for her own understanding of Flaxborough's intricate social machinery. By evening, when she returned home, she arranged her chairs and books with the same deliberate care as she had displayed all day, aligning each object to observe, record, and reflect. Purbright, standing at the threshold during a polite visit, realized that the widow's secrets were not merely her own. They encompassed the town's quiet rhythms, the unspoken allegiances, and the latent ambitions of its residents. In observing her, he had come to understand that Flaxborough itself could be read like a book, one whose pages were folded, annotated, and sometimes deliberately obscured, yet never without leaving traces for those patient enough to notice. The next morning brought a thin drizzle, leaving the cobblestones slick and glistening, as if the town itself had been polished for inspection. Flaxborough moved with its usual quiet precision, shopkeepers arranging displays with care, the baker's apprentice adjusting loaves in the window, and the postman navigating the streets with habitual vigilance. Into this familiar rhythm arrived a visitor, a man whose presence instantly suggested the outside world, however politely he conducted himself. Mr. Lionel Faraday, a horticultural writer from London, appeared at the Horticultural Society office shortly before 11. His coat was damp, and his briefcase bore the insignia of a respected publication, lending him an air of authority that Purbright observed without comment. Faraday spoke with courteous formality, complimenting the Society's recent flower show, while probing for details about the incident that had unsettled the previous day's proceedings. His eyes, sharp behind round spectacles, flicked over the room and its occupants, noting manner, posture, and the smallest deviation from ordinary behaviour. Mr. Clapp, anxious as ever, welcomed the visitor with an over-polished cordiality that betrayed his unease. Miss Penfold hovered nearby, fidgeting with papers, while Mrs. Grimble, who had arrived under the pretence of returning a borrowed seed catalogue, observed with the faintest hint of amusement in her expression. Purbright, seated unobtrusively, catalogued each movement and nuance, aware that the presence of an outsider could provoke revelations otherwise unspoken. Faraday inquired about minor discrepancies, including a shadow reportedly seen near the dais and the subsequent misplacement of tulip labels. The questions were phrased with deliberate impartiality, yet the manner in which he paused after each answer encouraged the subjects to fill the silence with more information than intended. Mr. Clapp's account wavered slightly, and Purbright noted the subtle shift in his tone, a barely perceptible tension, as if he were recalibrating the story to match perceived expectation. During a brief walk through the hall, Faraday mentioned noticing a figure loitering near the assembly hall the evening before the flower show. No description was available, but the implication that someone had been present prior to the event caused a ripple of quiet tension. Miss Penfold's hands tightened around a clipboard, and Mr. Briscoe's gaze flickered briefly toward the doorway. An imperceptible reaction, yet enough for Purbright to commit to memory. The afternoon brought a tea interval, ostensibly for refreshment, yet in practice serving as a stage for observation. Faraday conversed politely with various members, each exchange revealing small but telling details. He asked about prior flower shows, noted subtle rivalries, and elicited anecdotes that seemed trivial but collectively sketched a broader pattern of ambition, resentment, and pride. Purbright observed the carefully measured glances, the mild hesitation before replies, and the fleeting gestures of nervousness or interest that illuminated the unspoken social hierarchy. Mrs. Grimble, maintaining her usual composure, offered a quiet remark about soil composition, which led to a discussion on the peculiarities of council oversight in the allocation of public gardens. The conversation skirted the immediate incident, yet Purbright recognized its significance. The widow was linking seemingly mundane topics to undercurrents of tension that might explain motivations beyond clumsiness. By late afternoon, as Mr. Faraday prepared to depart, a minor revelation emerged. A misfiled ledger, previously unnoticed, was found tucked behind a filing cabinet, containing records of prior complaints, minor grievances, and subtle disputes among the Society's members. Though no accusation could yet be made, the presence of these documents lent credence to the possibility that the flower show mishap might be intertwined with longer-standing tensions, not merely the accident it appeared to be. Purbright remained silent on the matter, cataloguing each observation in his notebook. He noted the visitor's ability to provoke disclosure without overt questioning, the widow's careful collection of details, and the shifting responses of the townsfolk. In Flaxborough, the arrival of an outsider had not merely stirred curiosity, it had revealed fissures in social conduct that otherwise remained invisible. As evening descended, the drizzle ceased, leaving the town damp but untroubled in appearance. Yet Purbright, stepping lightly across the polished streets on his way home, understood that beneath the familiar rhythms lay subtle currents of ambition, secrecy, and apprehension. The visitor's questions had illuminated paths previously ignored, paths that Purbright knew would require patience and a steady hand to navigate, revealing truths that Flaxborough's citizens themselves might be reluctant to acknowledge. By the morning following Mr. Faraday's visit, the town's quiet murmurs had solidified into a tentative consensus. Miss Penfold, the young assistant at the Horticultural Society, had become, in the eyes of many, the natural person to bear the blame for the tulip mishap. Her proximity to the dais during the display, her nervous disposition, and the slight tremor evident when recounting her version of events made her an easy target. Even Mrs. Larkin, typically careful to couch observations in polite phrasing, suggested that youthful carelessness might be at fault, while others whispered that she had been a little too eager to impress Mr. Clapp. Purbright, however, took no immediate action. He observed the proceedings with characteristic patience, noting each word, each glance, and every gesture. Miss Penfold arrived early, straightening her uniform and smoothing papers, with hands that quivered imperceptibly. Her eyes darted toward the dais, then toward the doorway, then to Mr. Clapp, as if seeking approval and fearing censure simultaneously. Purbright made careful notes, recognizing that outward demeanor rarely told the whole story. The mayor, summoned under the pretext of a routine committee meeting, conducted himself with formal gravity, offering compliments to the display, yet subtly framing Miss Penfold as the person who must be guided more carefully. He spoke of responsibility in tones that carried both encouragement and implied reproach, and Purbright noted the small but significant tension in Mr. Clapp's responses. In the background, Mrs. Grimble maintained her usual quiet vigilance, knitting while listening, occasionally inclining her head toward a particular remark or gesture. Purbright observed that her attention seemed divided between Miss Penfold and Mr. Briscoe, the solicitor, whose overly measured politeness hinted at an awareness of hidden currents. As the morning advanced, the town council convened briefly to discuss minor administrative matters, yet the subject inevitably drifted to the flower show incident. Mr. Briscoe offered a carefully phrased recollection of the previous day's events, emphasizing the practical steps taken to restore order while noting the assistant's visible distress. The careful orchestration of words, however, betrayed subtle anxiety. His emphasis on procedure and propriety suggested an interest in controlling the narrative rather than a dispassionate recounting. Miss Penfold, summoned to clarify small points, provided her account with meticulous care. She admitted to having brushed past the tulip display, yet her voice carried a sincerity that suggested no malice. Her minor inconsistencies, slight hesitation over precise timing, fleeting misplacement of words, were noted by Purbright, who had long learned that truth often hid in such details. Meanwhile, the townsfolk, arriving to attend to other civic duties, whispered conjectures that ranged from sympathy to condemnation. Mrs. Larkin's sharp murmurs, Mrs. Pettigrew's thinly veiled disapproval, and even the mayor's carefully restrained sighs created a chorus of scrutiny. Purbright allowed the atmosphere to envelop the assistant, not to judge her, but to observe how others reacted to her presumed culpability, understanding that social pressure often revealed more than the facts alone. By afternoon, it became apparent that while Miss Penfold was the obvious suspect in public eyes, the minor clues accumulated over the previous days hinted at a more complex scenario. A misplaced ledger, a fleeting shadow observed by Mr. Clapp, and Mrs. Grimble's unobtrusive remark suggested that events might not be as straightforward as assumed. Purbright, patient as ever, refrained from commentary, cataloguing each behavior, each small hesitation, and each unguarded glance, knowing that the truth often emerged quietly in the subtle interplay of words and gestures. As the day drew to a close, Miss Penfold returned to her quarters, tense but composed, aware that she had become the focus of speculation. Purbright remained behind, making careful notes. The first suspect had been identified by the town, yet the evidence was circumstantial, and the small inconsistencies hinted that appearances might be deceiving. In Flaxborough, he knew, the neatest solution was rarely the correct one, and he resolved to continue observing with the same patience and precision that had always guided his inquiries. By mid-morning, a subtle unease had settled over the Horticultural Society office. Purbright arrived quietly, observing the minor adjustments being made to papers and ledgers. A small incident caught his attention almost immediately. A set of botanical sketches, long considered routine, had been found tucked behind a low cabinet. They were meticulously drawn, each flower labelled with scientific precision, yet their displacement suggested more than carelessness. Purbright made a note, considering that the sketches might indicate an overlooked interest, a minor obsession, or a subtle clue to prior grievances among the society's members. Miss Penfold appeared frazzled, shuffling through documents in search of her place among the files. Her movements were deliberate, yet marked by small hesitations, pauses that betrayed uncertainty. Purbright observed that she seemed unaware of the sketch's displacement, suggesting that someone else might have handled them, or that the papers had been deliberately moved to attract attention. The inspector catalogued this without comment, as the value often lay in observing the reactions rather than announcing the significance. Mrs. Grimble arrived under the pretense of delivering a small plant for the afternoon display. Her movements were deliberate, yet every glance, every tilt of the head seemed directed toward subtle observation. She noted a ledger slightly ajar on a side table and remarked in passing on the potential for clerical oversight, phrasing her comment as casual rather than accusatory. Purbright recorded the interaction, aware that even innocent phrasing could prompt a revealing response in the right subject. The mayor, appearing briefly, inspected the room with careful attention. He complimented the restored displays while subtly emphasizing the need for diligence and proper documentation. His manner was courteous, yet it carried an undercurrent of self-preservation. He was careful to appear concerned without showing any personal stake in the minor disorder, though his repeated glances toward Mr. Clapp suggested he was monitoring a subordinate's behavior as much as the state of the office. During the afternoon, another minor discrepancy emerged. A small envelope, unsealed and containing notes on previous flower show winners, had been left under a stack of papers. The contents were innocuous on the surface, yet their misplacement hinted at someone attempting to conceal or manipulate information. Purbright, noting the reactions of those present, saw Miss Penfold's eyes flick toward the envelope, followed by a slight tightening of the jaw, a gesture that spoke more of surprise than culpability. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grimble continued her quiet observations, moving between the office and a window overlooking the street. She conversed lightly with passing citizens, her questions seemingly trivial, about soil, sunlight, and plant health, but always designed to elicit subtle reactions. A passing comment about the order in which records were maintained prompted a faint hesitation from Mr. Briscoe, suggesting he had been aware of the ledger's irregular placement and its potential implications. By late afternoon, the accumulation of these minor disturbances, misplaced sketches, an ajar ledger, the envelope under papers, had created an atmosphere of careful scrutiny. Purbright observed the behaviors, noting who reacted with curiosity, who with nervousness, and who with deliberate indifference. Each movement, glance, and hesitation added layers to the developing picture, hinting at motives and connections that were not yet evident to the casual observer. The day ended with the restored order of the office giving an impression of normalcy, yet Purbright knew that the subtle misplacements and the reactions they provoked had revealed far more than the objects themselves. In Flaxborough, the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary, and the patterns of human behavior left traces that only patient observation could uncover. As he left the office, notebook in hand, he reflected that these small, seemingly trivial clues would prove invaluable in discerning the underlying currents of ambition, resentment, and hidden intent that threaded through the town's genteel exterior. By the following week, Flaxborough's outward calm seemed deceptively intact, though the undercurrents of curiosity and unease persisted among its citizens. Early one Tuesday morning, the verger discovered a small fire in the church vestry. The flames had been contained quickly, leaving only a faint odour of smoke and a small pile of scorched papers and ledgers. The damage, minor in itself, was enough to spark a ripple of speculation across the town. Purbright arrived soon after the verger had extinguished the remnants. The room smelled faintly of burnt parchment, mixed with the lingering scent of damp wood. The charred edges of the papers suggested carelessness, yet the neatness with which the floor had been swept hinted at someone attempting to obscure the sequence of events. Purbright examined the scorched ledgers carefully, noting the alignment of remaining documents and the small smudge of soot on the corner of a shelf, which suggested more than casual proximity. Miss Penfold was present, summoned to assist with inventory and to provide a first-hand account. She appeared tense, her hands twisting a folded notebook, as she explained how she had arrived shortly after the fire alarm sounded. Her voice was precise, yet marked with a subtle hesitation whenever she mentioned the missing items. Purbright made a mental note. The nervousness was consistent with surprise, but not necessarily guilt. Mrs. Grimble, having arrived independently to inspect the church's plant collection, moved slowly through the vestry. Her gaze was directed more toward patterns than objects, shelves, cabinets, and edges of papers. She commented lightly on the alignment of ledgers and the slight irregularity in the placement of shelves, as though drawing attention to things that would escape a casual observer. Purbright noted how even her passing remarks seemed designed to provoke subtle reactions without accusation, a characteristic that had already revealed much about her approach to observation. The Mayor and Mr. Briscoe appeared shortly after. Both wore faces of practised civility, though the Mayor's eyes betrayed a faint unease. He complimented the verger on his promptness, expressed relief that no greater damage had occurred, and offered gentle guidance on record-keeping. Mr. Briscoe's words were careful, structured, and seemingly neutral, yet the minor emphasis he placed on diligence suggested an awareness of the wider implications. Purbright observed their interactions quietly, noting how social posturing often revealed more than factual statements. Among the remaining papers, a small ledger that Mrs. Grimble had mentioned previously was absent. Its disappearance, subtle but significant, suggested either oversight or deliberate removal. Miss Penfold's expression shifted subtly when the absence was noted, her brows knitting in a way that hinted at concern but not culpability. Mr. Clapp, when questioned, offered a tightly controlled explanation, but his slight hesitation and the faint flicker in his eyes hinted at awareness beyond what he verbalized. Outside the vestry, gossip had already begun its quiet march through Flaxborough. Residents speculated on the cause. Some suggested an electrical fault, others implied carelessness with candles, while a few quietly whispered connections to the flower show incident. Purbright ignored the conjecture, instead cataloguing the subtle reactions of the individuals present. He observed who flinched at certain words, who lingered on details unnecessarily, and who maintained deliberate indifference, recognizing that human behavior often spoke more than documents or statements could convey. During the inspection, Purbright discovered a fragment of a note, its edges lightly singed, referring to a prior dispute within the society. Its placement among the burned papers suggested it had been deliberately concealed or overlooked. Though the content was incomplete, the fragment hinted at lingering resentments, minor rivalries, and interpersonal conflicts that might have motivated subtle interventions rather than outright accidents. Purbright noted the reactions. Miss Penfold's eyes widened ever so slightly, Mr. Briscoe's lips tightened momentarily, and even the Mayor cast a cautious glance toward the shelf where the note had been found. The timing of the incident was also telling. It occurred during a period when attention was focused elsewhere, the Society's preparations for a minor exhibition and routine committee work, suggesting that whoever was responsible, if anyone had intended interference, had chosen the moment with precision. Purbright catalogued this pattern, noting that deliberate misplacement often relied on the predictability of human habits, and that understanding those habits was as crucial as knowing the physical sequence of events. As the day progressed, a sense of unease lingered despite the lack of tangible loss. Citizens moved through the vestry with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, their conversations punctuated by polite concern and speculative remarks. Purbright watched silently as each person engaged with the situation. Some offered assistance, others lingered with anxious eyes, and a few maintained an air of casual detachment that upon closer observation appeared more protective than indifferent. By late afternoon the room had regained outward order. Shelves were realigned, ledgers accounted for, and the air cleared of smoke. Yet beneath the surface, Purbright recognized that patterns had shifted. Miss Penfold's position as the presumed culprit seemed less certain. The disappearance of the ledger introduced new ambiguity, and Mrs. Grimble's subtle observations suggested that additional threads connected the flower show incident to the vestry disruption. He made meticulous notes of gestures, glances, and hesitations, aware that the unfolding mystery was as much about human behavior as it was about physical events. When he departed the vestry, the sky was pale and damp from the lingering drizzle. Purbright walked along the polished streets, notebook in hand, reflecting that in Flaxborough even minor incidents revealed the interplay of ambition, caution, and concealment. The second incident, though small, had expanded the field of inquiry, drawing attention to patterns previously unnoticed and opening new avenues for investigation. Patience and observation, he knew, would remain paramount, for the truth often emerged not in dramatic confessions, but in the subtle interplay of routine, human frailty, and social expectation. That evening, the streets of Flaxborough were quiet, the usual bustle replaced by a faint mist that clung to the cobblestones and muted the distant sounds of the town. Purbright walked slowly, his coat collar turned against the chill, notebook in hand, considering the sequence of minor disturbances, the flower show fiasco, the misplaced sketches, and the fire in the vestry. To an observer unaware of the nuances, each incident might appear trivial, even disconnected, yet Purbright understood that the town's social fabric wove them together in subtle, instructive patterns. He paused near the bridge overlooking the canal, noting the reflections of lamplight on water and the way the movement of ripples mirrored human interactions. Unpredictable, overlapping, yet revealing underlying currents. In his mind, he catalogued behaviours observed over recent days. Miss Penfold's nervous gestures, Mrs. Grimble's deliberate remarks, Mr. Clapp's tight control over his expressions, and Mr. Briscoe's careful phrasing all suggested patterns of ambition, caution, and subtle manipulation. Purbright's reflections extended to the small rivalries that defined Flaxborough. Mrs. Larkin's sharp, seemingly innocent comments often concealed personal vendettas. The mayor's measured civility masked an unspoken need to maintain control over public perception. Even minor council disagreements hinted at deeper resentments. The incidents themselves, he realized, were almost irrelevant compared to the social maneuvers that followed. Human nature, in its combination of pride, vanity, and caution, revealed more than any physical clue could. He considered Mrs. Grimble at length. Her presence had been quiet yet persistent, each remark calculated to elicit subtle reactions without overt interference. In observing her, Purbright noted how the townspeople adjusted their behaviours, often unconsciously, revealing loyalties, discomforts, and priorities. The widow's method was patient and civil, yet profoundly revealing. She created a mirror in which the social intricacies of Flaxborough reflected themselves with surprising clarity. Miss Penfold remained an object of curiosity. Her proximity to the flower show incident and her visible anxiety had drawn public attention, yet Purbright reflected that appearances could be misleading. The assistant's minor inconsistencies, though noticeable, could be attributed as much to youth and inexperience as to any intentional misstep. He recalled the ledger discovered after the vestry fire, the displaced sketches, and the envelope under the papers. None offered proof of culpability, yet each contributed to a broader understanding of the subtle currents shaping behaviour. The inspector also revisited Mr. Clapp's account in his mind, parsing his words and noting the hesitation at references to shadows and movement. Clapp's anxiety, though carefully moderated, suggested a consciousness of reputation rather than intent to deceive. Similarly, Mr. Briscoe's polished words carried faint hints of preoccupation with social appearance, and the mayor's gestures revealed the interplay of authority and caution. Purbright understood that observing these behaviours rather than merely recording events was essential to untangling the emerging pattern. As he walked along High Street, Purbright noted minor interactions, a shopkeeper offering a carefully phrased greeting, a passerby adjusting a hat with imperceptible nervousness, children whispering and giggling at some imagined slight. These small, ordinary gestures held the same instructive value as the major incidents. They demonstrated how the town's social rhythms responded to perceived disorder, and how reputation guided behaviour even in trivial moments. He also considered timing and circumstance. The vestry fire had occurred when attention was focused elsewhere, suggesting either opportunistic mischief or a calculated test of observation. The pattern of displaced items, the sketches, ledgers and notes, was not chaotic, but ordered in a way that invited scrutiny from attentive observers. Purbright reflected that often truth revealed itself not in evidence alone, but in the consistency and inconsistency of human responses to circumstance. By the canal, Purbright paused once more, reflecting on the subtle humour inherent in small town life. The seriousness with which Flaxborough's citizens treated trifles revealed as much about themselves as about the events in question. Pride, vanity, and the fear of appearing inept could magnify minor occurrences into matters of significant social consequence. The inspector's mind catalogued these observations alongside behavioural clues, understanding that patience and quiet attention would yield more insight than immediate interrogation or overt investigation. Returning home, he passed Mrs. Grimble's house, noting the soft glow from her window and imagining the meticulous order of her interior. She, like Purbright, observed the town quietly, recording patterns, noting deviations, and connecting threads invisible to most. In reflecting on the interactions of the day, he recognized that social observation was an art equal in importance to the analysis of physical clues. Purbright's own method of inquiry was reinforced by these reflections. Each gesture, hesitation, and deviation from habitual behaviour carried significance. The subtle interplay between townspeople revealed tensions, loyalties, and motives often more clearly than words alone. By considering the ordinary alongside the extraordinary, the mundane alongside the dramatic, he could anticipate the movements of human intention and prepare for the next steps in a careful, patient unravelling of the truth. By nightfall, Flaxborough was cloaked in quiet, the mist lingering along narrow lanes, and Purbright retired to his study. He reviewed his notes, arranging observations into patterns of behaviour, social expectation, and minor rivalry. In the stillness, he reflected that patience, discretion, and a subtle understanding of human nature would guide the inquiry more effectively than any overt accusation. The small disturbances, the flower show mishap, the displaced sketches, the vestry fire were no longer isolated incidents. Each acted as a thread linking human ambition, pride, and concealed intention into a tapestry that, with care, could be unravelled. He finally closed his notebook, confident that the next day's observations would clarify more of the social puzzle. In Flaxborough, truth rarely revealed itself abruptly. It emerged quietly in gestures, glances, and the faint tremor of nerves under polite conversation. Purbright, patient and meticulous, understood that he must wait, observe, and allow the town itself to reveal its secrets, confident that subtlety and attention would illuminate the path forward. The morning arrived with an unremarkable chill, and Flaxborough proceeded with its usual blend of civility and quiet tension. Purbright, notebook in hand, arrived at the Horticultural Society office with a measured pace, aware that today required a subtler approach than previous observations. The recent incidents, the flower show mishap, the displaced sketches and the vestry fire, had provided data, yet the patterns of human behaviour remained incomplete. It was time to probe not through accusation, but through observation and polite questioning. Purbright arranged a small informal gathering under the pretense of reviewing administrative procedures for the upcoming horticultural display. Miss Penfold was present, her posture slightly rigid, hands clasping a notebook, eyes frequently flicking toward the dais as if seeking reassurance. Mr. Clapp, appearing composed yet alert, adjusted papers and glanced repeatedly toward his assistant. Mrs. Grimble arrived quietly, her expression composed, hands folded in front, yet her gaze seemed to penetrate the minor distractions and focus on subtleties invisible to most. The inspector began with neutral, almost banal topics, a review of record-keeping, minor adjustments to display schedules, and general questions about preferred soil compositions. His phrasing was courteous, his tone calm, yet the deliberate pauses between questions invited responses that revealed more than content. Miss Penfold's voice occasionally faltered when responding to seemingly trivial inquiries, and she glanced toward Mr. Clapp at moments that indicated uncertainty or the need for reassurance. Purbright paid particular attention to Mr. Briscoe, who maintained a carefully measured politeness, offering clarifications without introducing new information. The solicitor's minor gestures, subtle tightening of lips, brief hesitation before answering, revealed attentiveness to reactions rather than mere interest in facts. The inspector catalogued each movement, understanding that behavior under mild pressure often illuminated motives or concealed knowledge more effectively than direct questioning. Mrs. Grimble, knitting quietly at one side, offered occasional, innocuous commentary on horticultural techniques or local gardening customs. Yet even these remarks had an effect. She seemed to prod gently, eliciting small changes in posture, slight adjustments in tone, and fleeting glances that hinted at unease. Purbright observed how participants responded differently depending on the question or the framing, noting subtle variations in hesitation, eye movement, and hand positioning. The inspector then introduced a minor hypothetical scenario about record misplacement, phrased as a thought exercise rather than a pointed inquiry. Reactions were telling. Miss Penfold's hands twitched imperceptibly, her notebook shifting position as if to shield a perceived irregularity. Mr. Clapp's eyes briefly narrowed, yet he maintained composure, and Mr. Briscoe's polite smile suggested careful consideration of how much to reveal. Even the mayor's passing glance into the office hinted at awareness of tension, though he said nothing aloud. As the discussion progressed, Purbright noted the interplay between direct and indirect responses. Some participants volunteered information unintentionally, while others carefully avoided certain subjects. A seemingly irrelevant remark about a ledger's original placement provoked an almost imperceptible reaction from Miss Penfold. Her eyes widened for a moment before returning to neutrality. To Purbright, such a small signal carried weight far greater than any spoken confession. The inspector introduced a minor test of timing and observation, casually adjusting the order of documents on a side table while directing conversation elsewhere. The subtle shift prompted glances, brief hesitations, and minor corrections in the participants' behavior. These minute reactions, catalogued meticulously, revealed who was attuned to procedural changes, who was alert to social cues, and who carried anxiety over prior minor incidents. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had accumulated a significant amount of behavioral data without forcing any direct admissions. The interplay of glances, gestures, and subtle hesitations suggested that the apparent narrative of events was incomplete. Miss Penfold's nervousness, Mr. Clapp's controlled tension, and Mr. Briscoe's carefully measured interventions all pointed toward a deeper network of minor ambitions, anxieties, and concealed knowledge that had influenced the recent incidents. Mrs. Grimble's quiet presence remained particularly instructive. Her eyes, flicking occasionally toward those under scrutiny, elicited small, involuntary signals that illuminated underlying patterns of social awareness and deference. Purbright observed that her subtle prompts, combined with his staged adjustments, functioned as a mirror reflecting concealed intentions, rivalries, and the careful maintenance of appearances. As the gathering concluded, the office appeared outwardly unchanged, yet the inspector had achieved the desired effect. Each person's behavior had been subtly tested, observed, and catalogued, revealing inconsistencies, reactions, and minor truths that had previously gone unnoticed. Purbright closed his notebook, confident that the test had provided the insights necessary to refine his understanding of motives and to prepare for the eventual revelation of the truth. By evening, the town resumed its usual rhythms, but the subtle adjustments made during the test had already introduced a shift in awareness. Participants carried an unspoken consciousness of observation, a recognition that minor actions and omissions might have consequences beyond the immediate moment. Purbright reflected that in Flaxborough, the most effective revelations were rarely forced. They emerged from careful orchestration, patient observation, and the subtle interplay of human behavior, all of which had been achieved with polite precision that day. The following afternoon, Purbright convened a small civil gathering in the Horticultural Society office, the room arranged with deliberate care to allow observation without constraint. The participants, Miss Penfold, Mr. Clapp, Mr. Briscoe, the Mayor, and Mrs. Grimble, arrived with a polite awareness that this was no ordinary meeting, though none suspected the subtle orchestration behind it. The air was warm from the mid-afternoon sun streaming through the high windows, yet it carried the faint tension of unspoken anticipation. Purbright began by reviewing minor administrative matters, speaking with gentle politeness and measured pace, allowing each individual a moment to contribute while observing reactions to his tone and phrasing. He noted how glances, shifts in posture, and small hesitations revealed more than words alone. The earlier tests had prepared him, and now each subtle cue could be interpreted within a broader pattern of behavior, connecting past incidents with present demeanor. Yesterday's minor disturbances, Purbright began, and the events of the flower show itself may have seemed isolated, yet when considered together they suggest a network of intention, however indirect, that has influenced the flow of events in this office and beyond. He allowed the words to settle, watching Miss Penfold's hands tighten briefly on her notebook, Mr. Clapp's expression stiffen, and Mrs. Grimble incline her head slightly, signaling attentive observation rather than surprise. Purbright outlined the sequence of occurrences with calm precision: the displaced tulip sketches, the missing ledger, the vestry fire, and the minor concealments of notes. Each event was described without accusation, merely as observations, and the room's occupants reacted subtly, revealing acknowledgement, concern, or tension in micro-expressions and quiet shifts. He emphasized the context of social ambition and minor rivalries, illustrating how individual choices and behaviors, rather than overt malice, had created the situation that had seemed so perplexing. He then focused on small, apparently trivial actions that had gained significance under scrutiny. Miss Penfold's nervous gestures when questioned about document placement, Mr. Clapp's careful management of interactions to preserve authority, and Mr. Briscoe's attentiveness to public perception rather than procedural necessity. Purbright demonstrated how these behavioral clues, combined with minor oversights, had created the appearance of deliberate disruption while concealing subtler motives rooted in pride, ambition, and personal caution. The inspector's explanation revealed that the flower show incident had been less about clumsiness and more about the accumulation of minor human errors amplified by expectation and social pressure. The ledger had been removed temporarily by Mr. Clapp to prevent misinterpretation, the sketches displaced by a well-meaning but overzealous assistant attempting to organize archives, and the vestry fire was a consequence of carelessness with candle placement during routine preparation. None of the actions were malicious, yet their combined effect created an impression of deliberate interference. Purbright turned briefly to Mrs. Grimble, acknowledging her quiet vigilance. "Your observations," he said politely, "have clarified many subtle patterns and have been of considerable assistance in understanding how minor incidents can be magnified by perception." She inclined her head, a faint smile of quiet satisfaction appearing, acknowledging the role of patient, careful observation in revealing truth without confrontation. Finally, Purbright summarized the social dynamics that had contributed to misunderstanding: pride among committee members, a desire to maintain appearances, minor rivalries, and the human tendency to assume intention where there was none. Each participant had played a role, not through ill will, but through ordinary human behavior shaped by the expectations and anxieties of Flaxborough society. The calm, meticulous explanation left no single person at fault, yet illuminated the complex interplay of responsibility, perception, and minor ambition. The room's atmosphere, once tense with uncertainty, relaxed subtly. Miss Penfold exhaled quietly, relieved that her role had been contextualized rather than condemned. Mr. Clapp's shoulders loosened, acknowledging the understanding that no malice had been intended. Mr. Briscoe allowed a small, polite nod to escape, and even the mayor's expression softened, recognizing that the events had illuminated, rather than damaged, the social order. Purbright closed his notebook, the final gesture marking the conclusion of careful observation and patient deduction. The incidents, when understood through behavior and context rather than assumption, revealed not scandal but the natural consequences of human pride, expectation, and minor missteps amplified by attention. In Flaxborough, he reflected, the truth rarely required dramatic confrontation. It emerged quietly through observation, patience, and a gentle illumination of facts intertwined with human nature. By the time the group departed, the office had returned to its ordinary rhythms. Papers were rearranged, schedules adjusted, and the hum of civility resumed. Purbright, stepping into the fading afternoon light, considered how easily appearances could mislead and how careful observation allowed the ordinary to reveal extraordinary truths. In a town like Flaxborough, the smallest incidents held the richest lessons for those willing to watch, note, and understand. The morning following Purbright's explanation dawned with an unremarkable clarity, the sort of pale sunlight that revealed the ordinary beauty of Flaxborough without drama. Townsfolk moved with habitual purpose, shopkeepers arranging goods, children skipping along the cobblestones, and postmen navigating the streets with quiet precision. Yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts had occurred. Social tensions, previously heightened by gossip and conjecture, had eased, replaced by a calm awareness of the interwoven nature of the town's small dramas. Miss Penfold arrived early at the Horticultural Society office, carrying a notebook and a bundle of papers with a newfound composure. Her hands, previously tense, moved steadily, and her glances toward Mr. Clapp were no longer weighted with apprehension. The assistant had absorbed Purbright's calm elucidation of events, and the relief was visible in the softening of shoulders and the faint lightness in expression. She approached the dais to check arrangements, her movements deliberate and precise, reflecting a quiet restoration of confidence. Mr. Clapp himself maintained a composed front, yet subtle changes were evident. The meticulousness with which he inspected the displays carried no trace of prior tension, and his measured politeness toward staff and visitors alike was tempered by a slight ease that had been absent for weeks. Purbright, observing from a corner, noted the interplay of relief and residual concern, understanding that while the truth had been revealed, reputations and personal pride required careful maintenance to avoid lingering embarrassment. Mrs. Grimble moved among the society members with her usual quiet attentiveness, her knitting needles clicking softly. Her observations, no longer cloaked in the tension of uncertainty, now served as gentle guidance, highlighting minor adjustments and practical considerations without the weight of suspicion. She exchanged brief remarks with Miss Penfold, offering discreet advice on filing methods and plant placement, her demeanour calm, unobtrusive, and reassuring. The mayor passed through the office mid-morning, his expressions carefully neutral, yet softened by the clarity of events. He complimented the orderly return to routine and offered mild praise for the assistant's diligence. His usual concern for appearances remained, but the incident's resolution had diminished the need for anxiety. The town's underlying civility, carefully maintained by social expectation and polite observation, had reasserted itself with minimal disruption. Purbright took a moment to reflect on the social mechanisms revealed by the series of minor events. The flower show fiasco, the vestry fire, and the various misplacements had demonstrated not malice, but the interplay of human nature, pride, and perception. Each participant had acted according to their understanding of propriety and self-interest, revealing both the fragility and resilience of Flaxborough's social fabric. The inspector understood that the calm of the present day was the product of careful explanation, observation, and the polite illumination of circumstances rather than any overt punishment or confrontation. Over the course of the morning, minor adjustments were made to ensure order and prevent future misinterpretation. Ledgers were checked and secured, sketches and documents restored to their proper locations, and the dais rearranged to highlight symmetry and clarity. These practical measures, while seemingly mundane, had significant symbolic value. They reassured the townsfolk that order had returned and that minor missteps need not leave permanent blemishes on reputation. Conversations among the members, once hushed and tinged with speculation, became measured and polite. Exchanges focused on horticultural technique, upcoming events, and local news rather than assigning blame. Even Mrs. Larkin, previously inclined toward sharp remarks, offered mild commentary on plant care, her tongue restrained by the knowledge that Purbright's careful observation had revealed the triviality of prior disputes. Social equilibrium, fragile though it might be, had been restored. By early afternoon, the streets themselves reflected this restoration. Children played along the canal banks without concern, shopkeepers greeted familiar faces with habitual warmth, and neighbours exchanged small talk with an air of unhurried civility. The town moved as if the previous week's perturbations had been absorbed into its rhythm, leaving the ordinary beauty of daily life undisturbed. Purbright walked slowly along the high street, notebook in hand, observing the quiet order of human behaviour and the subtle ways social conventions had reasserted themselves. Later, as the afternoon sun softened, Purbright returned to his office. He reviewed his notes from the previous incidents, reflecting on how the minor episodes, while appearing disconnected, had revealed the underlying dynamics of ambition, pride, and human fallibility. Each event, each gesture, and each hesitation had provided insight into the delicate mechanisms that governed Flaxborough, demonstrating that truth could be discerned through careful attention rather than confrontation. Mrs. Grimble arrived briefly, bringing a small selection of seedlings for the upcoming planting schedule. She exchanged polite conversation, her comments calm, practical, and unobtrusively instructive. Purbright observed her work, noting once again how patient observation, gentle questioning, and subtle testing had shaped understanding. The widow's quiet presence, previously so enigmatic, now appeared as an integral part of maintaining the town's equilibrium, her attentiveness complementing the inspector's methodical approach. By evening, the town had settled fully into routine. Street lamps glowed softly, windows reflected the fading sunlight, and Flaxborough appeared, at first glance, entirely ordinary. Yet beneath this ordinary veneer, the recent events had left subtle traces, a renewed attention to detail, a cautious self-awareness among certain residents, and a recognition that minor errors, if left unexamined, could amplify unexpectedly. Purbright reflected that such lessons were permanent in a town defined by observation, etiquette, and the gentle correction of social missteps. As night fell, he returned to his study, noting that the ordinary order of life in Flaxborough had been quietly reaffirmed. Miss Penfold's confidence, Mr. Clapp's composure, Mrs. Grimble's calm attentiveness, and the mayor's restored patience all reflected the efficacy of careful observation, gentle revelation, and understated management of human behavior. Purbright made one final note in his ledger, recording minor observations for future reference, satisfied that the town's rhythms were restored without overt conflict or dramatic display. In the silence of his study, with the faint glow of a lamp illuminating tidy notes and neatly stacked papers, Purbright reflected on the nature of truth in a small town. It emerged quietly through observation, patience, and the subtle revelation of human behavior. The incidents of the past week, though trivial in isolation, had revealed a wealth of understanding about motive, social expectation, and the intricate balance of civility. In Flaxborough, such knowledge was both necessary and enduring, a reminder that even minor disruptions offered lessons too. Those willing to watch and listen